Okay, the first thing we're going to do is to define what a midpoint is. A midpoint, middle point, point in the middle, is the point that bisects a segment. Bi means two, sex like sections, two sections. So it's in the middle, it's the point that lies in the middle, and it divides your segment into two sections. So a segment's midpoint, as I said, it divides the segment into two, this word is important, equal segments. Okay, so the two sides are going to be exactly the same. So let's try a couple examples here. If A is the midpoint of segment MD and the length of segment MD is 7, then the length of segment AM is what? And the length of segment AD is what? Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this, and I'm just going to chunk this into information I can put in the picture. The first part says A is the midpoint of MD, segment MD. So if I know that A is the midpoint, it means it's exactly halfway. It means that it divides it into two equal pieces. Equal, meaning they're going to be congruent. And I've learned that if two things are congruent, if two segments are congruent, I can mark it in the picture by doing this. That way I don't have to read this anymore. The next piece of information I can put in my picture is right here. The length of segment MD is 7. Okay, when it's the whole segment, so it's like past a point, I usually like to do something like this so that I'm not confused. You know, I don't want to think 7 is for this part or this part. It's the whole thing. Okay, what do I need? I need to know what AM is, the length of segment AM, and the length of segment AD. Alright, well I've already decided that they are congruent, and in fact if I look at the definition, a segment's midpoint divides the segment into two equal pieces. So I'm going to do just that. 7 divided by 2, and it's going to give me 3.5 or 3.5. Okay, so that means that both of these segments are congruent and they're equal to 3.5 or 3.5. That's the same answer. It doesn't matter which one you put. Okay, let's look at the next example. If O is the midpoint of segment DG, so again, as soon as I see this is a midpoint, I know that this segment and this segment are congruent. So if O is the midpoint of segment DG, and GO, the length of segment GO is 4, those points are right next to each other, so I'm just going to go ahead and put a 4 above there. I'm going to know that it's for that segment. Okay, what do I need? I need DO. Well, if this is 4 and this was a midpoint, that means this has to be the same. So DO is going to be 4. So the length of segment DO is 4. And the length of segment GD, okay, GD or DG, that segment's the same. So it wants the whole thing. Well, I'm just going to double this or add those two together. It gives me 8. So instead of dividing by 2, I'm now multiplying by 2. I'm doing the inverse. Okay, let's look at the last example. The last example is actually an algebraic application of the midpoint. So I'm going to need a little algebra. If you need to review that, I have some lessons for that as well. Okay, I is the midpoint of segment TP, so I'm going to go ahead and mark these as congruent because that's what midpoint means. It bisects the segment. If the length of IT, TI, same segment, is 3x plus 7, so I'm going to go ahead and write that between those two dots. The length of segment PI is 5x minus 1, so PI or IP, it's the same, 5x minus 1. And I'm going to have to find the length of segment PT. I'm going to need this whole length. Be careful. Common mistake here is people find their X and then they think they're done. This is actually asking me for that whole length. Okay, so what do I know again about a midpoint? Well, I know that these two are equal. They are congruent. So when I see an algebraic expression like this, I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to set up an equation that I can solve. Well, they're equal. What are they equal to? They're equal to each other. So that's going to be my equation that I'm going to solve. Okay, let's see if I have, yep. Okay, so when I solve this, let me write it over here. Remember that when you're solving, you want to get your variables on the same side of the equal sign. So I've got variable terms on both sides and constant terms on both sides. So I'm going to have to move two things. I like to keep things positive, so I'm going to go ahead and subtract 3x, but you could do this by subtracting 5x. It doesn't matter. You'll get the same answer in the end. This is going to cancel out to make 0. I have 7 equals 5x minus 3x is 2x. I'm just going to add their coefficients, minus 1. Alright, I'm trying to get x alone, so I'm going to add 1 to both sides. This is going to cancel out and make 0. So I have 2x on the right and 8 on the left. And then the last step I need to do is, this is 2 times x, the inverse or opposite is divide. So that's going to give me 1x, and 1 times x is just x, so that goes away. So x is equal to, oops, I almost threw my scale off. I got to make sure I do it to both sides always. Okay, so 8 divided by 2 is 4. So the first thing I had to find was what the value of x was. But remember, they're asking me for the length of PT, so I'm not quite done. So this is helpful, but it's not my final answer. I'm now going to come up here, and I'm going to actually, before I find PT, I want to make sure that this makes sense. So if I substitute 4 into here to find this length, and then substitute it here, remember, those are supposed to be equal. If they're not, there's something wrong. Maybe my setup or my algebra. So let's go ahead and substitute 4 for x. So 3 times 4 plus 7. So 3 times 4 is 12, plus 7 is 19. And then let's do it over here. 5 times x is 4. I'm just substituting and evaluating. 5 times 4 is 20. Multiply, then subtract. 19. Okay, great. So good news, we got these two are equals, so that makes me feel really good about the value of x that I found. I still have not answered the question. If the question would have asked me what is TI segment, the length of TI or IT, that's 19. The length of segment IP or PI, that's 19. But it's asking me what is the length of segment PT. So PT, I'm going to get that by adding 19 and 19. I get 38. It's a total of 38. And that's my final answer right here. Okay, and I'm feeling really good about it because I've checked, I've substituted. I had 2 equal segments here, 2 congruent segments, so I'm pretty happy with my answer. I made sure I answered the question, I reread it. Looks good.